Hello, and thank you for joining us to learn about the Lake Roesiger Integrated Aquatic Vegetation Management Plan. Many of you may be wondering what this plan exactly is. In short, it's a plan developed for your community to help provide a roadmap of how to best address the invasive aquatic plants that are affecting the lake health and recreation at Lake Roesiger. Since it's a plan for the community, it's essential that all of you are involved to develop the plan. So thank you for taking the time today to learn about the plan and then provide your input. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Marisa Burghdoff with the Snohomish County Lakes Management Team. We're with Surface Water Management in the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. In addition to myself, my coworker Jen Oden have worked heavily on the grant work and writing as well as the development of this plan. In addition, we've brought in lake experts from Tetra Tech Inc. and ESA to help with the technical aspects of the plan. You'll be hearing from Dr. Toni Pennington today for much of the plan description. By the end of this presentation, we hope you have a good idea of the plan that you feel confident in deciding the next steps for the community. We'll start off by talking a little bit about the background and history of the community work on invasive aquatic plants. Then we'll go into each of the invasive aquatic plants, what they look like, and how they can be identified, as well as the problems they cause. We'll then dive into control methods that can work for these aquatic plants. And then we put together what we think are the best options to help Lake Roesiger. You could then choose from these options and put your information into an online survey to give your feedback. Finally, we'll talk about funding and next steps to help complete this plan. I'm just going to provide you a brief history of the aquatic plant control at Lake Roesiger. Eurasian water milfoil has been the focus of most past efforts. Snohomish County has been working with the community on its control since it was first discovered in the 90s. While the effort was funded for many years, in 2018 the county lost its funding. The Community and Boat Club has been able to fill the gap, but the plant persists, making it a threat to the lake health. What has really emerged as a bigger problem in recent years is fragrant water lily. This plant has covered much of the middle basin and is causing rapid sedimentation of the lake, filling it in, so the middle basin is becoming much more of a wetland and has large mud islands through much of the area. The plant has also been creeping up in the north and the south basins. This has led to many efforts by individuals in the lake to try and control this plant. The Community and Boat Club has also spent extensive time and effort trying to understand the best control efforts and has enabled residents to do things including putting bottom barriers, which they obtained a permit for and installed themselves also to help with navigation. However, it was recognized that even though these efforts were helpful, a new, broader approach was really needed to address this plant given the magnitude of its infestation. Several community members lobbied the county to apply for and obtain grant funding to help the community. The first step to develop grant funding is you need to develop an integrated aquatic vegetation management plan. The plan will then set you up to apply for implementation grants through the same program later on. We applied for the grant and received it successfully, which has brought us to where we are at today. The plan was developed using a framework put forth in a Citizens Manual for Developing Integrated Aquatic Vegetation Management Plans from the Department of Ecology. The first step was to map all of the plant species, which was completed in June 2021. We then worked with the Lake Roesiger Community and Boat Club to develop a draft plan. The club appointed 12 volunteers representing each of the 3 basins to help provide input into the goals and the best suited options for Lake Roesiger. We're now in the stage to obtain community feedback through this presentation and survey. We'll then finalize the plan and implement, and we'll discuss this at the end of the presentation. I'm now going to turn this over to Toni Pennington from ESA.
Thanks, Marisa. Now that we have an understanding of how we got to this place with developing the plan, I thought it was important we go over some of the benefits of aquatic plants in freshwater lakes. First off, they're an integral part of a lake ecosystem. As far as fish, they act as a nursery environment and as well as providing cover. Aquatic plants filter out pollution and protect water quality. They also provide habitat for other aquatic life, particularly birds and turtles. And with native aquatic plants, they typically have natural controls, whether those are invertebrates or other animals that can keep the plants in check, as opposed to invasive aquatic plants, which don't tend to have any natural controls. So conversely to native aquatic plants, invasive aquatic plants tend to create a nuisance situation in lakes. This can be aesthetically displeasing, and also there's evidence that it can impact home values or property values. Invasive aquatic plants tend to displace our native plant community and harm the local ecology by disrupting circulation patterns in the lakes, for example, dissolved oxygen. And they tend to be quite adaptive, taking over environments where there are no native plants growing. They tend to obviously be very prolific and have few natural enemies. And there tends to be a quite high cost to control, especially with certain species at very high densities. So this figure illustrates the difference between a native diverse plant community on the left compared to more of a monospecific invasive plant community on the right. On the left, you kind of get a sense for how fish can use a more diverse plant community with different types of cover, where you have rooted plants and those that are rooted and have floating leaves. On the far left, you can see that. As opposed to the far right in a monospecific stand, where fish tend to use the edge of these plant stands for cover, but don't tend to use the middle of the stand quite as much. And part of that is attributed to limited visibility, but also changes in water circulation patterns, as I mentioned previously. For example, changes in dissolved oxygen, which might be quite high at the surface of the plant bed, but quite low down below. Same with pH and other factors that can contribute where fish will choose to spend their time based on perhaps water quality or visibility. When discussing aquatic plants, we typically discuss them in terms of their growth form, in terms of shoreline, emergent, or submersed. So a shoreline plant might be something like a juncus or a yellow flag iris that grows along the shoreline, but its feet or its roots typically need to be somewhat wet. An emergent plant is typically one we characterize as being rooted in the bottom of the lake, but have leaves that float on the surface or emerge out above the surface of the water. And a submersed plant is rooted again in the lake, but all of the plant parts are typically completely underwater. So the county conducted a detailed plant survey in 2021, and I'm going to go over some of those results, but I want to point out that more detailed information on that survey is found on the Snohomish County project website for the lake. The website's listed here, and it comes up a couple of more times during the slides. During the survey conducted in 2021, Snohomish County identified 16 beneficial native plants along the shoreline, along with fairly large areas deplete of substantial vegetation other than lawn. If you're unfamiliar, lakewise.org is a great resource for information on replacing lawns with shrubs, perennials, or trees, while still preserving lake views and lake access. Before jumping into the invasive target plants identified in the 2021 survey, I wanted to briefly cover the classes of noxious weeds and what they mean in terms of density and distribution, but also how the state and counties view their priorities for management, therefore funding. Washington State Noxious Weed Board advises the Washington State Department of Agriculture and develops the noxious weed list. Class A noxious weeds are non-native species whose distribution in Washington State is still limited. There are no Class A noxious weeds known to occur in Lake Roesiger. Some examples might include flowering rush and variable leaf milfoil. Class B noxious weeds are widespread in some areas, but not all. The state or county Noxious Weed Control Board have the option to designate a plant for mandatory control of noxious bee plants. Class C weeds are already widespread, so control is typically not mandatory. Snohomish County encourages control and provides education and technical support for removal of these weeds. Class A noxious weeds are the highest priority, followed by B and then C. As part of the 2021 survey, there were 3 shoreline invasive plants found. The first we'll talk about is invasive knotweed. We believe this to be Japanese knotweed, but this particular genus of knotweeds can be quite ambiguous. So for now, we're going with the invasive knotweed in the plan is how we reference it. Invasive knotweed is considered a Class B noxious weed in the state of Washington. This plant is known to displace native vegetation. It's extremely fast growing and is very aggressive. A lot of people might recognize it by its sort of bamboo-like appearance, which you can see in the far right picture. Invasive knotweeds are known to result in lower quality habitat for fish and wildlife in the riparian areas. And they also can result in changes in nutrient cycling and have reduced water quality. And like many invasives, the dense stands tend to crowd out native vegetation. Also found during the 2021 shoreline survey of the lake was purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife is characterized by a very bright, showy, purplish pink flower. However, this is also a Class B noxious weed and tends to cause some of the similar problems as other riparian or shoreline invasive plants, such as Japanese knotweed, which crowds out native vegetation, displaces those native plants that would otherwise provide more desirable habitat to native species. Lastly, of the shoreline invasive plants found along the lake is yellow flag iris. This is a Class C noxious weed in the state of Washington, and similar to other invasive shoreline plants, also crowds out native vegetation. Yellow flag iris is characterized by a very bright yellow showy flower, which can be desirable for some. However, this plant can trap sediments and increase some of the water levels in the area in which they grow and displace native plants that would otherwise provide habitat to other fish and wildlife species. Again, detailed information on the distribution and density of the shoreline target plant species can be found on the county's website for this project. But in general, the survey identified small infestations of invasive knotweed on 11 parcels, mostly in the north and south basin, as shown by the red dots. And purple loosestrife was identified on 24 parcels, mostly in the middle basin and the north end of the north basin, which is indicated by the purple stars. Yellow flag iris, which are the yellow areas, was widespread around the lake. There were 10 species of submerged aquatic plants found within the 2021 survey of the lake. Of those submerged native plants, examples include bladderwort, elodea, a macroalgae called nitella, water celery, and the emergent, partially submerged, partially emergent bulrush. All of these species provide good diversity within the lake, good habitat for native fish and wildlife, but there has been observed reduction in some of these native species, potentially by slender arrowhead, which I'll get to in a second. There are two invasive submerged plants known to occur in the lake. The first is Eurasian water milfoil, which is a Class B noxious weed, and Snohomish County has designated for control. Like many invasive submerged plants, milfoil commonly grows at the near exclusion of other submerged species. It disrupts natural lake mixing that can result in substantially higher water temperatures in the surface, while reduced dissolved oxygen in the lower water column. Dense milfoil growth also increases nutrient cycling that contributes to lake aging. Milfoil can spread readily by fragments, and in fact, each leaf node can produce roots and is capable of forming new plant beds once they become established. Slender arrowhead is the second submerged invasive found in the lake. It is a Class B noxious weed, but has not been designated for control by Snohomish County. In Lake Roesiger, it dominates more than 40% of the lake's littoral zone, forming large monocultures. The long-term impacts from dense stands of slender arrowhead are not well understood, as it only occurs in 5 lakes in Washington. Finally, fragrant water lily, pictured on the left, is a Class C noxious weed, meaning control is typically not mandatory. Snohomish County, however, encourages control and provides education and technical support for removal of these weeds. When in flower, fragrant water lily is easy to distinguish due to its bright and showy flower. However, when not flowering, its leaves can be confused with the beneficial native water lily, pictured on the right. Leaves of fragrant water lily tend to be more rounded compared to its native counterpart, which tends to be slightly more oblong with a slight point at the tip. Both species have clefted leaves. However, the cleft of fragrant water lily tends to be slightly more rounded. It should be noted that the native lily is found in Lake Roesiger, and again, landowners are encouraged to explore the project website to see those locations. And while native water lilies might be considered a nuisance by some landowners, this plan does not address the management of those native species. With regard to the distribution of the invasive, submerged, and emergent aquatic plants around the lake, within the North Basin, the grass-leaved arrowhead dominates the entire shoreline of the North Basin, with some nitella, which is the macroalgae, interspersed in between. There's also patches of elodea, bladderwort, and water celery within those grass-leaved arrowhead beds. Eurasian water milfoil is found in very isolated pockets, some of which have probably been removed by the community even since these maps were created. And then the invasive fragrant water lily is found in the southern portion of the North Basin. Again, I encourage you to look at the Snohomish County website for this project to get more information on the distribution of these plants within each basin. Within the South Basin, grass-leaved arrowhead by far dominates the border of the entire South Basin. Again, there are patches of native elodea and bladderwort within these beds, but by and large, this is the dominant plant community within the South Basin. Again, there are limited examples of Eurasian water milfoil, some of which may have been pulled by lake residents. And fragrant water lily is observed in the northeastern portion of the South Basin, and then moving into the linkage between the South and the Middle Basin. The Middle Basin is dominated by fragrant water lily, shown in pink in this map, and slender or grass-leaved arrowhead, shown in green. Interspersed within the fragrant water lily beds are areas of bulrush and bladderwort, which are native. And interspersed within the slender or the grass-leaved arrowhead are areas of elodea, bladderwort, or water celery. There are small patches of Eurasian water milfoil indicated by red, many of which may have been removed by community members since these maps were created. And the orange patches in the southeast portion and the western portion are the native lilies that I mentioned previously. As part of developing an integrated aquatic vegetation management plan, ecology requires that all aquatic plant control methods be evaluated. In this case, that includes manual, dredging, mechanical, bottom barriers, chemical approaches, and biological methods. Now, not all of these are being recommended as part of this plan, but as part of the citizens' guidance that Marisa discussed earlier, all possible controls must be at least evaluated and considered whether or not they're applicable to the particular water body. So again, all the methods must be reviewed per the guidance from ecology, and no one method is likely to suffice in achieving the management goals that the community desires. So all of them must be considered as part of the process, and recommendations are then made based on an integrated approach that are intended to be adaptive to the changing needs of the community. So in this particular table, the items on the left are the overall type of control. In the center are the particular methods related to that control, and as they apply to the particular target plant. In this case, Eurasian water milfoil, fragrant water lilies, slender arrowhead, invasive knotweed, purple loosestrife, and yellow flag iris. The particular methods that are identified in red are those that we felt would be the most applicable for that particular plant species. And those that we've moved forward with based on an effectiveness for that plant, the community input, and costs, among other things. The primary manual methods being considered in this plan include diver hand pulling, or what's referred to as DASH, which is diver assisted suction harvesting. In diver hand pulling, it's quite physically when a diver is simply pulling the weeds out by hand and transporting those to shoreline. Using DASH system, there's more of an automated system where the plants are physically pulled into a hose, and that hose is pumps the plants up to a boat, and they're filtered out, bagged, and transported off-site. Both of these systems are particularly useful for Eurasian water milfoil, slender arrowhead, and fragrant water lily. The benefits and advantages here are that the entire plant can be removed. It can be species specific when the visibility is good. The plants can be removed from around obstacles such as logs and docks. And it's currently being used at the lake by the community club and by lake residents to control invasive lilies. Some of the disadvantages is availability of contractors, and the rate for payment for work is really based on market price and who is doing the work, whether it's commercial divers versus lakefront property owners. Either way, you really must remove all plant parts, including the roots and rhizomes, depending on the species we're talking about. There is a relatively high cost compared to aquatic herbicides because there's physical labor involved, and relatively small area can be covered within a season. And invasive lily removal is highly labor intensive. We heard from the steering committee that there was a desire to remove not only a number of invasive aquatic plants, but also a buildup of muck, particularly in the Middle Basin. One approach to accomplishing both of these management goals is the use of hydraulic dredging. This involves physically removing sediment and plants from the lake, transporting all of that sediment and water off-site for dewatering, and then further transport off-site. The benefits of this, of course, it removes not only sediment and plants, but also increases channel depth. And we're estimating that it could remove up to 3 feet of channel of sediment buildup to increase that channel depth. Some of the disadvantages is extremely expensive, and approximately 2 acres of upland area are needed per acre of removed sediment up to 3 feet. And hydraulic dredging does not work well around submerged objects such as docks and logs, and there's extensive permitting that's involved. We also considered the use of mechanical control methods, in particular harvesters or weed cutters. In particular, their use on fragrant water lily could be beneficial. There's a variety of, I call them contraptions out there, because if you look online, you'll see a number of different devices that have been developed depending on the water body, submerged obstacles, and the plant species. One of the advantages is it definitely clears channels. It won't do so much to remove sediment, but it will remove the vegetation from channels. Some of the disadvantages is that if a harvester is used in an area with milfoil, that milfoil must be removed, otherwise we'll just be cutting and spreading more fragments. The equipment also may not be available regionally. So in some areas, say in Wisconsin, this equipment is readily available and can be transported between lakes. However, in the Pacific Northwest, they're relatively limited. So in some instances, for example, county PUDs have elected to simply purchase their own equipment and use their own operators as opposed to renting the equipment. Again, they don't work well around submerged obstacles, and they do require frequent operations similar to mowing your lawn. So this is where some of the expense can be incurred even if the equipment is purchased locally. Moving on to chemical control options. Of the approximately 300 herbicides that are approved for use in the United States, only 16 are currently registered for aquatic use. Of those 16, 3 are proposed for potential use in Lake Roesiger. The products were selected based on a number of factors, including the management goal for the particular target species, the product's efficacy on that target species, the safety of the product on human and environmental health, and any ecology imposed use restrictions above those on the product label, including swimming, fishing, or irrigation. It should be noted that for any chemical control applied to water, a permit from ecology is required, and only products that are approved by ecology may be used, and they must be applied by a licensed applicator with an aquatics endorsement. The first of 3 potential chemical control options available to Lake Roesiger is the fluoroperoxyfen benzyl, otherwise known as Percellacor. This is a systemic herbicide, which means the chemical moves or translocates through the plant, killing both the roots and the top part of the plant. Systemic herbicides are generally slower acting than a contact herbicide, but they tend to result in longer control of the target plant. In this particular case, Percellacor is especially targeted to milfoil, although there's evidence that it could impact slender arrowhead as well, and cause some stress to the fragrant water lily. Some of the applications and advantage of a milfoil, again, is it's highly specific to milfoil with little to no human or environmental risks. And when I say that, that information is taken directly from Ecology's publication in 2017. They put together a supplemental environmental impact statement for their latest NPDES permit for aquatic plant and algae management. So listed below here are some of the human health risks and environmental risks, as well as some of the other mitigation measures or restrictions. And these are all, again, taken directly from either the supplemental impact statement from Ecology or from the permit itself. So some of the, again, the advantage is highly specific to milfoil, but conversely, when you have a low density of milfoil, the use of an aquatic herbicide it makes less sense because you're applying a product to control a very small patch. So this is only recommended when hand pulling a milfoil is no longer a viable option. The second aquatic herbicide considered for use is imazapyr. This is a broad spectrum systemic herbicide, meaning it similarly translocates throughout the plant like Percellacor, but is not as selective to one particular plant species. Of the target plants at Lake Roesiger, it's labeled for control of fragrant water lily, yellow flag iris, purple loosestrife, and knotweed. Some of the advantage is that imazapyr has no additional restrictions or advisories by ecology. This goes above and beyond the label that's approved by EPA. This includes no fishing or swimming advisories. Washington Department of Ag has evaluated the ecological risk to terrestrial animals, plants, and aquatic animals, such as fish and invertebrates. And both terrestrial and aquatic species are not likely to be adversely affected by imazapyr under prescribed conditions according to the label. There is little to no impact to submerged vegetation from the appropriate use, I should say, of imazapyr, and efficacy has been demonstrated regionally, in particular Beaver Lake. Some of the disadvantages of imazapyr is, as I mentioned, it's non-selective, so it will damage native plants and other desirable ornamentals. Imazapyr can persist in the soil and damage adjacent trees, so you have to wait several months before you do any replanting. There are restrictions on irrigation and potable water that may apply to folks around the lake who may have those water rights for those uses. And again, information on the risk to human and environmental risk, as well as potential mitigation measures or restrictions, are summarized in the tables below, and these were taken from ecology publications. Imazapyr was chosen as an option not only because it's effective, but because we evaluated and deemed it to have a relatively favorable toxicological profile. The third and last aquatic herbicide considered for use is imazamox. It is a systemic herbicide that's labeled for use on fragrant water lily and yellow flag iris. Similar to imazapyr, imazamox has essentially the same advantages and disadvantages. In particular, no additional restrictions or advisories by ecology, very favorable toxicological testing, which indicated imazamox is, quote, practically non-toxic to fish, birds, mammals, and invertebrates, including insects such as honeybees. And its efficacy has also been demonstrated regionally, for example, in Shadow Lake and Lake Union. It is also highly mobile in the soil, but persists for less time than imazapyr. And it carries the same restrictions on its label for irrigation and potable water for those who have water rights for those uses. And again, information on the human and environmental risks, as well as potential mitigation measures or restrictions, are summarized in the tables at the bottom and taken from publications from ecology. And lastly, again, we selected this as a potential chemistry because it has a fairly favorable toxicological profile. The application of imazapyr and imazamox typically require the use of an adjuvant, which is a broad term describing an additive that enhances herbicidal activity. Surfactants are a type of adjuvant that can accentuate the dispersal of the herbicide by, for example, reducing the surface tension of water, permitting the herbicide to more easily penetrate the waxy cuticle of leaves, or allowing subsurface applications to sink more deeply, where they may be more effective for controlling floating leaf plants. There was some concern from steering committee members over the use of adjuvants in combination with imazamox and/or imazapyr. Only those products reviewed by Washington State Department of Ag and approved for use by ecology are recommended as part of this plan. Further, only adjuvants that are listed by Washington State Department of Ag as, quote, practically non-toxic for the two acute toxicity categories evaluated, which were rainbow trout and the aquatic invertebrate Daphnia, would be considered for future use. King County uses a similar approach for their treatments of yellow flag iris, where the product Agridex is commonly used. The overall goals of the Lake Roesiger Integrated Aquatic Vegetation Management Plan are intended to be overarching and not specific to an individual species. These goals were vetted with the steering committee and are a requirement of the entire Integrated Aquatic Vegetation Management Plan process required by ecology. These goals are the foundation of the plan and are intended to be adaptive throughout the life of the plan. And overall, the goals are to reduce the distribution and density of invasive plants in Lake Roesiger, to improve recreational safety, usability, and navigability of the lake, also to improve water quality and overall lake health, and lastly, to improve habitat for fish and other aquatic species. Second goal is to prevent the spread of invasive species, not only to, but from Lake Roesiger in the case of slender arrowhead. And thirdly is develop a comprehensive education outreach plan on prevention and effective control measures. Early in the discussions with the steering committee, a series of plant management approaches were tabled and discussed to prioritize specific target invasive species within the lake. The first priority was Eurasian water milfoil, which is a Class B noxious weed. The management goal for Eurasian water milfoil is eradication of the small remaining infestations, followed by monitoring for early detections of new infestations. The recommended control method for this goal is to increase diver hand pulling, also increasing frequency of annual monitoring. If that increased diver hand pulling and monitoring cannot begin, say, in 2022, an option for achieving the management goal of eradication is the use of the aquatic herbicide Procelacor to reach that management goal of eradication. The second priority identified by the steering committee was the management of fragrant water lily, which is again a Class C noxious weed. Many in the community have a desired goal of full eradication of fragrant water lily, but recognize this may be difficult to achieve, given the size and longevity of the infestation. Instead, an approach that uses incremental goals towards eradication were evaluated to reduce the rate of lake aging or filling in, prevent the further spread of invasive lilies within the lake, improve navigation between basins, and keep the main navigation channels open. Also to open navigation paths to lake residents. And to significantly reduce the coverage of fragrant water lilies and slow new sediment buildup in lily pad beds. And lastly, to reduce historic sediment buildup within the lily pad beds. To evaluate these different approaches, 3 different control methods were recommended and further evaluated, and those included hydraulic dredging, chemical control, and mechanical harvesting. And those will be further presented when we discuss the scenarios. It should be noted that if left unaddressed, the rate of lake aging due to the dense growth of fragrant water lily will continue. The third priority identified by the steering committee was the management of invasive shoreline plants. For this group of invasive species, the management goal includes 2 things: to prevent their further spread and reduce their current coverage, and if possible, eradicate small areas of even invasive knotweed and purple loosestrife, but also to educate landowners on ways to manage or remove on their own properties. A few different recommended control methods have been considered: to simply rely on homeowners to control plants on their own properties, also provide increased education on the identification and control methods, and provide landowners with workshops and other outreach materials so that they can properly identify the plant and understand what options are available to manage these plants on their properties. The fourth priority plant management species is slender pondweed. The goals in managing slender pondweed are to reduce the rate of lake aging or filling in, prevent the spread of this species to other water bodies. As I mentioned, it's only found in 5 water bodies in the state of Washington. To reduce the current coverage within the lake, provide landowner education, and to target up to 20% removal per year, depending on funding. The recommended control approach for achieving this goal is through the use of diver-assisted suction harvesting, or DASH. The steering committee was very clear that prevention of invasive species through education and outreach is very important to protect the ecological integrity of Lake Roesiger. This could occur through volunteer outreach to the larger community or within lake residents. As far as the larger community, potentially have members visit the lake boat launches, especially on heavy use days, and provide education about cleaning, draining, and drying boats. And then within the lake, develop and implement an outreach campaign to prevent introductions of invasive species from other boats and other activities from lakefront property owners. Also distributing through mailers, email, and social media. So the intent of the plan is to provide a roadmap to achieve the plant management goals that were identified by the steering committee and the community. The plan will have to be revised and updated regularly, depending on available funding, actual bids for work, and new treatment technologies, just for example. So the plan is considered to be adaptive to meet the evolving needs of the community and new plant species or changing densities of plant species. So to accomplish this, we put together a series of 4 scenarios that focus on the varying levels of fragrant water lily control. But first, I want to cover the management actions that are common to each of these scenarios. Again, the following slides will walk through management goals and actions that are common to each of the 4 fragrant water lily management scenarios. Given the relatively low density of Eurasian water milfoil in the lake, Eradication is the management goal for this target species. Through diver hand pulling and annual surveys, it's intended that milfoil be eradicated from the lake within 5 years, again continuing with annual monitoring. This management goal is reflective of densities that were observed in 2021 surveys, and it assumes that hand pulling would begin in earnest in 2022. If not, the application of the aquatic herbicide Procelicor is recommended to achieve this management goal. It's estimated that to achieve this goal, it will cost approximately $22,000 a year every year, which would cover the removal of the plant, but also the surveys. All management scenarios for fragrant water lily address invasive shoreline plants. The management goal for this group of target plants, which includes invasive knotweed, purple loosestrife, and yellow flag iris, is to prevent the spread of these species to new areas within the lake and to reduce existing populations. This will be accomplished by individual landowners following workshops and outreach tools to properly ID plants and present control options. The cost associated with these actions is estimated at $15,000 per year for the first 2 years. The management goal for slender arrowhead under each fragrant water lily scenario is the removal of approximately 20% aerial coverage per year, scaling up or down depending on funding. The proposed approach for removal would be through diver-assisted suction harvesting, or DASH, at an estimated cost of $22,000 per year. Lastly, common to each fragrant water lily scenario is the inclusion of an invasive species prevention effort, which was highly favored by the steering committee. The intent is to lower the risk of spread of invasive species into Lake Roesiger, but also in the case of slender arrowhead, just as an example, to prevent its spread from Lake Roesiger to other nearby water bodies. These outreach efforts are estimated to cost approximately $3,500 per year for the first 2 years. The intent of Scenario 1 is to provide the highest level of impact to fragrant water lily and to remove legacy sediment in the middle basin, where the management goal would be 80 to 90% removal of fragrant water lily and approximately 3 feet of sediment removal to improve navigation. Following dredging, it is assumed that diver-assisted suction harvesting, or DASH, would be used to remove errant plants near submerged structures such as logs. Use of hydraulic dredging is expected to be a one-time event at an estimate of $22 million in year 1, again combined with DASH, and approximately $88,000 per year thereafter to maintain this level of reduced biomass to meet the goal of 80 to 90% reduction of fragrant water lily. In the North and South basins, eradication of fragrant water lily is the management goal, and DASH is the proposed approach for reaching this goal. Cost to achieve this goal in the North and South basins is estimated at $56,000 for the first 2 years and $17,000 in years 3 to 5. It should be noted that these costs do not factor any supplemental efforts by landowners for control around private docks or swimming areas. So putting together management elements that are common to each scenario, along with those specific to Scenario 1, total estimated costs per year are summarized below. Per parcel costs are based on the above total divided by the 463 lake parcels. Assuming full funding of the aquatic plant management grant of $75,000 over 2 years, the last line summarizes the estimated cost per parcel under Scenario 1. It should be noted that the cost per parcel is here to provide context, is not binding or commitment. But this step was necessary to flesh out the potential cost for each scenario based on the management goal and the tools required to meet those goals. Scenario 1 represents the highest management goal for reducing invasive fragrant water lily and muck removal, but it does come with this heavy price tag. And also the total estimated cost for implementing all other management goals for milfoil, shoreline plants, arrowhead, and invasive species prevention would still be incurred. This scenario has an extremely high cost that also sadly comes with a low probability of being funded or potentially even permitted. The intent of Scenario 2 is to provide a moderate level of impact to fragrant water lily in the middle basin and eradication in the north and south basins. For the middle basin, this assumes a 40 to 50% reduction in aerial coverage, primarily through the use of aquatic herbicides. For the north and south basins, Scenario 2 also assumes applications of aquatic herbicides with the goal of eradicating errant populations of fragrant water lily. It's expected that costs would decrease after year 3 in the Middle Basin and after year 2 in the North and South Basins. Similar to Scenario 1, Scenario 2 assumes that supplemental efforts would be incurred by homeowners where controls occur around private docks or swimming areas. It should be noted that multiple treatments would likely be needed to avoid sags and dissolved oxygen due to decaying plants. This chemical option was chosen to achieve moderate results as no other mechanical means such as DASH were viable at the scale needed to reach this level of control. Imazapyr and imazamox were identified as the most appropriate chemical options. They've been shown to be effective in King County lakes and have little to no human and environmental health risks except for to non-target plant species. In the Middle Basin, the main navigation channel would be priority. However, it's anticipated that properties can be prioritized if desired, or if deemed feasible by the applicator, avoided if alternative management options are preferred. Putting together management elements that are common to each scenario, along with those specific to Scenario 2, total estimated costs per year are summarized below. Under Scenario 2, assuming full grant funding, the estimated cost per parcel is $135 per year in the first 2 years. A slight increase in year 3 is assumed due to higher costs in year 3 for control measures in the Middle Basin, but they would estimated to decline again to $134 per year in the Middle Basin as those plant densities decrease. This is the most cost-effective method to achieve the highest level of lily control at the goal that's presented of 40 to 50% reduction. It should be noted that even if the plan doesn't include chemical treatment, private landowners could still choose to independently hire a professional to apply for a permit and, if granted, treat near their property. The intent of Scenario 3 is to provide a low level of impact to fragrant water lily in the Middle Basin and assumes a continued spread in the North and South Basins due to unchecked growth and spread of seeds and other plant fragments. The management goal for Scenario 3 is a 15 to 20% reduction in aerial coverage of fragrant water lily in the Middle Basin using a primary approach of mechanical harvesting. Harvesting would be focused on the center navigation channel and deeper portions of the residential channels. Efforts in the North and South Basins would rely on workshops and outreach to assist landowners in proper identification and appropriate control measures. It should be noted that cutting may increase the spread of lilies and other target plants to other areas of the lake. Putting together management elements that are common to each scenario, along with those specific to Scenario 3, total estimated costs per year are summarized below. Under Scenario 3, assuming full grant funding, the estimated cost per parcel is $136 per year in the first 2 years, increasing to $177 per year after grant funding is exhausted. While Scenario 3 is a relatively low-cost estimate per parcel, it represents less control compared to the use of aquatic herbicides. That is, the goal of Scenario 3 is a 10 to 20% reduction using mechanical harvesting compared to a 40 to 50% reduction goal under Scenario 2 using ecology-approved aquatic herbicides and at similar costs. Based on feedback from the steering committee, it was very clear that a non-chemical option should be considered. And based on the goal of 15 to 20%, it was deemed mechanical harvesting might be the best approach to reach this goal. Scenario 4 assumes a status quo, which maintains a low level of Eurasian water milfoil using diver hand pulling every 2 years. This assumes that the existing milfoil population will maintain at its current state. However, this may result in a higher risk of spread. This is currently paid for by volunteer lake association dues and donations at a rate of $10,000 every other year.
Thanks, Toni, for the great description of the plan. This is Marisa Burghdoff again with Snohomish County Surface Water Management. Once we decide to finalize the plan, the next step is to find funding to try and implement this plan. The first option for funding is to have Lakes Association collections. This is a wide range of ways to collect funds, informally or formally, from people around the lake. It's typically a volunteer dues or donations, such as what's already being done at Lake Roesiger. There's a lot of pros to this approach. Roesiger already has the structure in place, It's very flexible and it's not dependent on the county, so you don't have to work with the county at all to implement the plan. The cons is that it can be inequitable, as some people may not be willing to donate for the work, and there also is a high amount of uncertainty in funding each year. The second option to fund plans such as this is to establish a lake management district. This is a self-taxing district for property owners to help fund lake management. It's established in Washington Administrative Code. Lake Roesiger used to actually have one of these in place in the 1980s, which funded a lake health study. The pros are it's extremely effective, it allows for a broad range of actions, and it's a very fair democratic formation process. The cons of it is that it's very complicated and it's not very flexible. It can require to bond to start, and because it has such a rigorous startup process, the costs are $30,000 or more just to get the funding structure set up. The last option is to set up a surface water fee surcharge. This is basically where the community requests to their county council that they would like to have a higher surface water fee than their typical one that they already pay. The extra amount that's paid would be designated to only use at Lake Roesiger for the purpose designated by the community. It requires broad community support in order to be passed, and it's been successfully set up for Lake Ketchum, Lake Goodwin and Shoecraft, and Lake Serene. The pros are it's very equitable, its fee structure can be decided by the community, and it also allows for senior exemptions because it's completed through the typical tax collection process. There's also a less administrative overhead and is much less costly to set up than a lake management district. The cons are it does take some time to set up. The county must do the contract management for any work funded through this process, and it must be renewed every 5 years. If the community decides they would like to go ahead with the option 3 of a surface water fee surcharge, there is a rigorous process. First, you would develop a proposal. You would then meet with your county council representatives. Lake Roesiger actually has 2. Then there would be public outreach, such as in meetings or mailers about it, so people could express their concerns and show their support or not. And then if there was support, the county council person would introduce it and it would go through the county council process, including public hearings. And finally, there would be the assessment if it passes. We hope that you now have a better understanding of the Roesiger plan and know what options we have to choose ahead of us. So we highly encourage you to please go online and complete the survey so we can hear from you. You have until October 17th to complete the survey. The next step after that is we'll have those survey results ready so you can attend the online community meeting. We'll discuss those results and answer any questions that you may have about the plan or those final results. And finally, once they're narrowed down to a couple options, you'll be able to cast your final vote. That vote will be open from October 28th to November 10th. It will also be online, and we'll also be sending out a mailer notice to let everybody know. So thank you again for your time, and we really appreciate it.